Hello everyone, my name is Rachel Whitehouse and I'm a range agrologist for the Ministry of Forest Lands and Natural Resource Operations and Rural Development at the Cascades Natural Resource District in Merritt, BC. Today I'm going to talk to you about the role of timing in utilizing forage and weeds in your rangelands. And I'm going to start out by rambling kind of on about some background thought that went into this, and then I'm going to get into cattle grazing to target spotted knapweed. And I did have good intentions of turning this into a more robust research study, but I did not have the resources and time to make that happen this year. So this is a bit of redneck science where I'm just going to show pictures and talk about what I saw. But the premises of this research was based off of Christy Gordon's master's project at Thompson Rivers University, and she will be presenting on it on November 2nd. So if you're interested in more of kind of the actual research and numbers on why this worked operationally, then I encourage you to tune into her presentation. So first, to get an idea of the area, this is the range in question. It's outside of Merritt, predominantly grassland ecosystems. And historically, this was a commonage situation where anyone could turn out however many cows they wanted to graze, which led to historic overgrazing problems. Eventually, the grazing rights got transferred over to one rancher under our current grazing tenure system, and that rancher had been running 750 cow-calf pairs. But we'd started to notice that there was still kind of declining plant communities, declining cereal states, and an increase of invasive plants occurring. Particularly spotted knapweed in these Marquardt West and Marquardt East pastures, and those will be kind of the pastures that we focus on today. When those issues were kind of coming to light, the rancher decreased his cow numbers down to 500 head in an attempt to mitigate some of those issues that were occurring and stop the spread of spotted knapweed. And when that happened, we established permanent photo point monitoring plots that look like this picture on the right-hand side here, in each of the pastures to track kind of how those pastures were then improving. And so when I took this over, I noticed that many of these pastures, after 10 years of these reduced cattle numbers, were actually not changing or even declining, even worse in plant community and cereal state. So I kind of figured there was something not right here, and we needed to figure out what was going on. And one other thing I'll mention is the grazing schedule that had been occurring. So this range was on kind of a clockwise, counterclockwise rotation, where on one year they would come out, move around the fields in this direction, and the alternate year they'd kind of move around counterclockwise through all the fields. And this photo on the bottom right is the cows out there in the Marquardt West pasture in September. And you can see that dark gray, shadowy color up on the hills is all the spotted knapweed that has died and gone to seed. So just a bit more of a closer look at the spotted knapweed in that Marquardt West pasture. The pink is some mapping that was done of the knapweed, but that was done about 6 years ago, so it has increased since then. We haven't had time to do more updated mapping. So the first thing that I wanted to wrap my head around is the plant communities that were occurring in these pastures. So they were predominantly grassland, but not 100%, and some pastures were dominated by different things. So what I did was I kind of went out and did as many assessments as I could, which are shown by the black triangles, and I looked at range health and the dominant plant species that were there. And then I lumped each of those into a pasture type and then kind of ran a little GIS exercise where I drew out everything that was similar and then merged them with those range assessments. So the broad pasture type categories I gave were forested, invaded native. So invaded native is when the dominant grass present were kind of blue bunch wheatgrass, needle grasses, different native grasses, but there was a heavy component of invasive plants present. Invaded tame pastures were those that had been historically seeded to crested wheatgrass, brome, or Kentucky bluegrass type of community, but also that heavy component of invasive plants present as well. And then native was predominantly native, tame was predominantly tame. And so what I really wanted to focus on was the utilizing each of those pasture types at their optimal time. So forested, you don't want to use those too early, but you also don't want to use them too late because the pine grass tends to become quite unpalatable as the summer goes on. Native grasslands, we've always kind of known that it's better for plant health to graze native grasses later in the summer, kind of after end of July. But I would argue that cows also find them more palatable at that later time in the year. Native pastures, tame species are adapted to earlier grazing. They can withstand kind of that earlier spring grazing. And I also believe that, or they're also much more palatable earlier in the year than later on in the year. They become kind of over mature and a bit skunky, and cows don't tend to prefer those species at that kind of August, September type of time frame. And then the invasive species, so particularly spotted knapweed was our main invasive plant, but research by Christie showed that cows will, in fact, eat spotted knapweed in that kind of early July time frame, and it's actually significantly more nutritious than the surrounding grasses during that time. So with all those things in mind, what did I do? I changed the grazing schedule. So just focusing on those two pastures, Marquardt East and Marquardt West. So originally they would have been grazing those pastures from September 1st to September 11th, and then September 12th to September 18th, and that was with 500 cow-calf pairs. So what I did was I changed the timing based on kind of those optimal times of use for those types of species that were present, and I had them grazing Marquardt West from June 16th to July 7th, and Marquardt East from July 8th to August 1st, and I actually increased the number of cows by 25 head. So here's a picture of those cows out in the Marquardt West pasture in that September period. So all that grass at the beginning or at the foreground of the photo is kind of crested wheatgrass and brome. So you can see that the cows are kind of laying in it, but they're not really eating it. They're not interested in it. What they were doing is they were going up past all of this spotted knapweed into the hills, and they were looking for those remaining plants of blue bunch wheatgrass, and they were grazing on those quite heavily. What happened? Here is a photo point in that Marquardt West pasture, July of last year. So that's when the cows had been out there in the late fall there rather than early. So you can see that's all spotted knapweed, that green biomass. There's a few other forbs mixed in, but heavy amounts of spotted knapweed. And this is what that same spot looked like after 3 weeks of cattle grazing. So very obvious that they consumed a fair amount of knapweed biomass there. Yeah, that was all would have grown up and looked like that picture on the left, and then matured, gone to seed, and died out and kind of just been waste on the ground. But the cows at that June time period were able to eat it while it had grown and turn it into energy and protein. So you may be, here's just another comparison that I have here of another photo point plot. So knapweed's a bit shorter in here, but this is in early July. And that's kind of the level of cover of knapweed. And then this is in September of this year after that earlier grazing. So you can see some knapweed still went on to mature and flower, but significantly less than what would have been there. You may be thinking, I guess they just ate all of the grass and there was nothing but knapweed left, so they had to eat it. But here are some pictures of right around where those other photos were taken. And you can see there's a fair amount of grass that was left. Healthy stubble heights of grasses were left, despite that increased number of cows and increased period of grazing. And keep in mind, most of this grass that you see here are these tame species, so they are adapted to graze at this time anyways, so they will remain healthy and kind of come back just as they were the next year. This picture on the bottom left, you can see this is an old knapweed skeleton from the year before. So that's kind of what all of this knapweed would have grown up to look like had it been left to grow during this time period. And then it's a bit hard to see, but I saw a lot of this. So this is a blue bunch wheatgrass plant, and there were little knapweed seedlings right at the base of it, and the cows were actually kind of picking at just the knapweed leaves and just eating the leaves of the knapweed and not touching the grass during this time. So I did manage to get a bit of data collected, and I looked at the number of knapweed flower heads in grazed versus ungrazed plants. So, and plants that had been grazed during this period and then regrown, they had an average of about 8 flower heads, while plants that had never been grazed in other pastures, they had an average of 15 flower heads. So NOVA gives you a p-value of 0.00009. So you can say that grazing significantly lowered the number of flowers per plant, which likely translates to less seeds per plant. And then this top photo here is taken in September, so that's a little Europhoro seed-eating biocontrol weevil. The first 3 flower heads that I picked at, I found one in each plant, so I didn't want to disturb them too much, but it's obvious that there is still a good number of biocontrol agents present here, despite the grazing happening. One more comparison photo here. So once again, this is early August of last year, with the cows not coming out here until September. And this is with that changed rotation this year. So that's not to say that there were no flower heads. There was just much fewer, and they also seemed to flower at very staggered times this year. So I noticed some were flowering in July and some didn't flower and start flowering until September. So that could have been also due to the dry climate this year, in addition to the grazing that occurred. And then just some questions that I still have to answer for myself. So Christy did her master's project in another pasture but on this range with the same herd of cows, where she actually had them fenced into a smaller area where maybe they were forced to eat knapweed because there was less selection. So I'm not sure if this herd of cows had been kind of trained from that previous experience and then taught the rest of the herd, and is that necessary for this to be successful, or would you have the same results with kind of a virgin herd? So is it better to hit the same area hard for a few years, or alternate between different pastures? So those results I showed you were from that Marquardt West pasture. By the time they moved into that Marquardt East pasture, the knapweed had just matured that little bit more, and they didn't seem to be utilizing it to the same extent. They were eating flower heads, but they weren't kind of eating the whole plant down to the base. So would it be better to kind of follow the same rotation for a few years, or would it be better to next year turn out early in the Marquardt East first and put some pressure on that knapweed before moving to Marquardt West? And then lastly, I don't know if this will result in improved rain condition and healthier plant communities and less knapweed. I hope it will, and I kind of expect it to, but I don't know for sure yet. But what I will say is we went from using those two pastures from 2 weeks to 6 weeks and utilizing this resource, which has been previously unused and just thought of it as a nuisance, but we were able to use it, feed it to cows, and then that had a domino effect on the rest of the pastures, which were all then able to be used a little bit less time, less pressure, which was really good in a drought year like we had, that we were able to increase the cow numbers, yet still have healthy stubble heights and no overgrazing occurring on this range. And in fact, the rancher actually got to this tent pasture in mid-September and said he didn't have time to use these two upper pastures here before he had to be home for preg testing. So these two predominantly grassland pastures got a year of rest that they have never been able to receive before in a drought year, because we were able to utilize all of this knapweed now. So yeah, I just want to leave you with, I find as land managers, we tend to, if we see a problem, our first thought is that there's too many cows and we need to remove the cows. But I challenge you to maybe kind of think about all the other ecological factors that are occurring on your range, and maybe we just need to make a simple change, as I've shown here, to better use our pastures rather than reduce cattle numbers. So thanks for listening today.